functioning prison for its first 36 years until 1886. It held convicts that were shipped over from England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, about 10,000 of them, sent here to relieve the overflowing prisons from over there and to help populate and build this colony over here. And by 1886, the 10,000 convicts had whittled down to about 70. Convict era had come to an end. This prison was handed over to the local government and transformed into the maximum security prison that it functioned as up until 1991. The main prison for Western Australia, the only dedicated maximum security prison for all that time in this half of the country. In 1991, after all of that time, it hadn't really changed that much. And so by that stage, it was well and truly out of date. It was unsanitary, insecure, inhumane, and they closed it down, and no one was surprised. The people only surprised really was that it was open for so long. 3 months after it closed down, it reopened as this museum that we're using it as now. 27 years ago that happened. It's been World Heritage listed, so everything's been left as it was, restored to earlier periods in some cases. Watch your step, watch your head as we walk around, as the ground's uneven and there's some short doorways in there. Take photos, just turn the flash off if you photograph any artwork that we come across. Otherwise, if you can have your phones on silent, everyone else will appreciate not hearing them. And just stick together and we'll get through everything and everyone will hopefully get out at the other end. Now the focus of this tour is just of that latter 100 years. From 1887 to 1991, when it's the maximum security prison for WA. And it all starts here at this door. You're backed up in a van with all the other inmates. You file in, give this calico bag, and you put all your clothes and belongings into that bag, and then you hang on the peg there above your head and you sit down on this bench, naked as the other 20 inmates you brought in here. That bench is World Heritage listed as well, so it hasn't been touched or cleaned or changed or anything like that. And then one by one, you're invited to step up here and toe the line. Thanks for being my first volunteer. So, right this way, come on down. So, toes on the line, 1 foot either side of the H. I need to check that you're not smuggling in any drugs or weapons now. Okay. Alright, hands out, fingers spread, palms up, arms up. Open your mouth, open your nose, wider. Lift your feet up for me, lift your feet up both at the same time. And now squat down and cough twice. Did you guys see anything fall out the back? Lastly, you need to turn around and bend over. I'll get this rubber glove out and we'll get to the bottom of it. You can go back to your school. So you get a shower, you get a uniform, pair of shoes, bag of toiletries, here's your rule book that outlines the rules and routine you're obviously expected to follow. You get your mugshot taken, and then you're escorted across the grounds and thrown into your cell and you work out how to survive from there. There's a glass box here for Section 43 prisoners, and that means protective custody. We're talking about sex offenders, pedophiles, informers, ex-policemen, ex-prison officers. These kind of people don't mix too well with other prisoners for their own safety. They're isolated in a separate division is enough in most cases. In more extreme cases, they need to be held in a cell with its own yard, completely segregated from everybody else for their safety. At the other end of the spectrum, you also get incredibly dangerous prisoners like this young man, for example. He needs to be segregated to protect everybody else. We get both ends of the spectrum. We have serial killers in here and all of the worst people that the state has ever produced. But then there's also, petty thieves and even juveniles in here and women as well. So there's really the full gamut, full spectrum of people. It's quite a challenge to keep them away from each other in many cases. But that's what it's all about. We're going to go inside and have a look around. If you have any questions on the way, let me know. Otherwise, right now. built this main cell block from 1850 to 1860. They built it out of limestone, dug from under our feet. You can see the original line of the hill up there. So they've levelled all of this and used all of that stone to build all of this and the wall around it. Now it's very convenient to have the main building material right here under our feet, but that's all it had going for it. It's very poor quality stone, as it turns out. It's very soft, and you get a good indication of that if you look at the wall over there. So it's soft, so the problem with that is that prisoners and convicts can dig through it to hide things inside, to escape through. And then rats and cockroaches and all sorts of vermin would also burrow into it and essentially infest the place for its entire lifetime. Now, after the convicts have built that, they're essentially sent outside the prison. They spend their days outside building the infrastructure of the colony. Now, and that seemed to be a reasonable idea because the convicts were essentially petty criminals. But when this becomes the maximum security prison, you have a lot more serious criminals, and so you're obviously not going to send out serial killers out there to, build a bridge down the road. So everyone's contained in here. The more dangerous criminals requires heightened security as well. So they extend the height of the wall for one, which you can see if you look around there. There was just the one gun tower at the front of the prison and one at the back. When the convicts were here, they now put one on each corner, and then over time add another two. So by the end there's 6 gun towers. They weren't always manned around the clock. That would happen after a long period of time. And changes like that generally come about when something goes horribly wrong. For example, in 1943, when 2 prisoners climbed up that gun tower that you can see down in that corner, during the day it was unmanned and unlocked, which both of those things were not meant to happen at the same time. So these 2 prisoners climbed up, lowered themselves down the other side and escaped for a few weeks, committing some pretty horrible crimes in the process. So shortly after that they thought it was a good idea to keep someone in there more often than not. Guards are armed up there with a rifle. They're the only guards in the prison really that are armed with firearms. Others, it's generally the ratio is about 10 to 1, by the way, prisoners to guards. And the guards on ground level, they're armed with a truncheon and a whistle, essentially. Now, we've got a lot of different prisoners in here. So that big cell block was just one big hall initially for the convicts. So they divide that up shortly after into 4 divisions, 4 main divisions. And we'll explore each one in a bit of detail. But essentially, you got minor crimes and short sentences down that end, more serious crimes, long sentences down that end. In 1890, they wall up that corner, and that becomes the women's division, holding only about 70 women at a time, generally convicted of petty crimes. Again, we'll explore that. They put the wall up, obviously, to protect the men from them. And then the gold rush kicks in towards the end of the century. The colony expands rapidly. The prison expands with it by adding a new division on the end down there, which they decided to call New Division because it's the new division, if you're wondering how they come up with a name like that. And that holds death row prisoners, and otherwise it's an overflow division for the rest of the prison. Again, we'll explore that as well. Now, what prisoners are left to do all day? They have an exercise yard at the back of each division. If they're not working, then they're just hanging out in the exercise yard. You know what they say about idle hands, so it's considered a very dangerous place to spend your time. So it's very good to get a job in the prison. It helps pass the time. It gives you skills that you can hopefully use, to keep you out of crime when you're released, and it keeps you out of that yard. The work that these prisoners do is just obviously confined within the prison largely, and it benefits the prison. They basically run the place. They're guarding and cooking and cleaning and doing the laundry and making the uniforms and making the shoes and making these concrete tiles and helping process inmates, other inmates even in the reception area, polishing the floorboards, doing everything that's required to run the prison. Guards supervise, making sure they don't kill each other and escape. There's various levels of trust, various levels of reward associated with different jobs. Sadly, there's only ever enough work for about half the prison's population. So half of them are always stuck in the yard and that's just trouble waiting to happen basically, and we'll check out that soon enough. Okay. Any questions about any of this? I'm just trying to sort of take you through the transition at this point.
What is the colour of buildings addition? So this is a later addition.
Yeah, sorta. Actually, no. No, this was pretty much right from the start. That black gate was one of the first things that they built, for example. I mean, so that was built in the 1850s. But that wall, 40 years later, was out of the same stone, but come 1900, they used a different stone to build the new division out of that they brought over from right next stone, because they worked out how bad this stuff is by that stage.
So this actually all the way back to the original building.
Yeah, yep. All right, let's move on in. Workshops around here. Behind that green door was the metal workshop and the mechanic shop. You've got concrete works behind here as well. This is a shower block, one of a few around the prison. Now, the official capacity in this modern era is 1,100 prisoners, and showering that many people is no easy thing to do. They have to bring in guards on those particular days just to drag people to and from the shower block. On Tuesdays and Fridays are the showering days. Something as simple and basic as getting to shower every day becomes really quite a privilege in a place like this. It's all about just the essentials, really. And working in the kitchen with the hygiene requirements, you get to shower every day. So that is one of the reasons why working in the kitchen is considered to be the best job in the whole place. I'm going to go in there and have a look at that. Sometimes even just to see the rest of the prison. They don't all see everything in here. They'll all just confined to their own division. Now, this is the kitchen. This whole section is 3 rooms. So you've got cleaning, cooking, preparation. There's big fridges in the walls there. You have about 25 prisoners, a couple of guards, and a civilian instructor. I'm going to show them here. It's full of equipment as well, all the functioning equipment which is sent to other prisons when the place closed. So there was a deep fryer and pie warmers over there. This is all filled with bread ovens as well. So it's a hive of activity. Prisoners are relatively self-sufficient in here. You definitely need to be able to trust the people working in here. It's a high pressure job and high reward as well. But obviously, people can, if they've got the right mindset for it, I suppose, they can do us quite a lot of damage. For example, like the prisoner who didn't like anyone and decided that he wanted to crush up a whole lot of razor blades and put that through the pastor one day just to see how that would go. Now, you're working hard, but you get rewarded. So you get out of your cell first. That seemed to be an advantage, because otherwise you're in your cell for 16 hours a day. You get to eat first, you get to shower every day, you get paid the most too. $36 a week was as good as it got. So $1 an hour, basically. It's only up to about $50 these days. But you're cooking for over 1,000 people, 3 times a day. It's no easy way to do that. So high pressure job, naturally hazardous environment too. Prisoners aren't known for how well they control their temper generally. So, you know, you can have some pretty nasty things happening here very easily. It can escalate very easily. And the limestone, if you recall, I mentioned the bad quality of that. You can again see an example of that in there. So that gets the better of the prison on numerous occasions. And you consider a place like this, it's generally run, you know, on a pretty slim budget. So if a big store of the food gets infested, they can't afford to just get rid of it. They've got to make do. Luckily, most of the meals involve these big boilers. You know, big soupy stews are a great way to disguise any dodgy food. But in the late 1960s, the population of the prison is way over capacity. So the official capacity, 1,100, it's up at about 1,800, 1,900 at this stage. So there's pressure on all corners. The prisoners start complaining that there's maggots in their meat, in their food, and other things like that. The guards don't really do anything about it, and so the prisoners take matters into their own hands and basically stage a riot. They all stand out in the yards, refusing to go back in, demanding interviews with the superintendent. They want to demand changes and all of that. But the prison doesn't respond to actions like that. Obviously, the prisoners feel like they have no other way to go about it. But this extends for about 8 hours. It gets increasingly heated. Guards open fire, sending a couple to hospital, and that's the end of that siege. But a lot of changes do actually come out of that anyway. They put a new officer in charge of the kitchen for one. But there's a few other things unrelated to the kitchen that improve the conditions in here. Yeah.
What was the main food that night?
The main food, well, that was different at different times. It just changes with the times. So, I mean, again, with those big boilers, you're dealing with a lot of sort of soupy, nondescript kind of stew sort of things. Occasionally, there's a prisoner in here that's, you know, maybe a qualified chef. You know, so generally, you've got to kind of earn your stripes, earn the trust to get in here. But there was one occasion that we know of where there was a guy in here only for a few months, and he was a qualified baker. That's right. And so he's making all these fancy pastries and things for everyone, and everyone's very happy about that. But you know, it's pretty rare. So if you ask the prison officers, right, and we've had former guards working here up until just a few months ago, they would tell you that the food was fantastic, just out of a restaurant. But you ask the prisoners, like reading their diaries and things like that, and they'd say it's more like straight out of the bin. Like you get served 3 meals, but just not all of them were actually that edible, and so you know it was pretty rough. Let's move on. First thing every morning, their toilet buckets is what I'm talking about, and they would empty those buckets into this open sewer here. Some of them, though, would prefer to empty their buckets over the wall into the dog's yard, as they called it. After 1970, that division was for pedophiles and sex offenders. Not very well liked in the prison. You'd also see prisoners in here and the yard on the other side of it filling up milk cartons with boiling water from the urn here and just randomly throwing that over the wall as well. So they're segregated to protect them from, you know, this sort of treatment. Of course, escalates a lot if they're found face to face. One prisoner, you don't have to take that segregation if you don't want. So it's not prescriptive. So if you feel like you can handle it yourself, then you can mix it with everyone else. For some, that works out okay. For others, it certainly doesn't. And there is a story of one man who's the father of one of his victims was also in the prison at the same time. And so he got a job in the kitchen where this guy was working and ended up decapitating that man. So things get pretty nasty. Now, one guard stands behind the cage down there. And he watches over everything that happens out here as best he can. Prior to that riot I was talking about inside in 1968, the guard would roam around the yard. But after the riot, they decided that was too dangerous. So now he stays back there watching. He'll come out with other guards as well if there's an incident, but he has to see that to know that there's something wrong. So now he's stationed permanently back there. Basically everything that needs to happen goes on way down here, hidden in the cubicles behind the urinal. Other prisoners are in the way, distracting him, and you know, it happens all too easily from that point on. They say that prisoners rule the yard. Guards would often come to an arrangement with some of those prisoners. If you can maintain some semblance of order out here, you know, so we don't have to come out and deal with things, then maybe we can, you know, return the favour, look the other way on a few occasions as well. You have to say it's just out of necessity that they would do that. It kind of boils down to this. At the same time, it's an incredibly toxic environment, and it's difficult for people to resist being lowered into some pretty depraved behaviour. And a common saying was that the only difference between prisoners and guards was the colour of their uniform. Now, there was no shelter before 1968 either. And there's no consideration for the weather. If the routine says you're out here, then that's where you are. And there's not a lot to do. And there's a lot of prisoners stuck out here in these small, boring confines with tension just growing, and inevitably tempers are going to flare. Let's move on to the next yard. So the little yard we just walked through didn't always hold sex offenders and pedophiles, but previous to 1970 it was for juveniles, so boys aged between 13 and 17. Instead of coming out in the yard or going to work, they would go to school in a big hall above the kitchen. So you can see that jutting out up there. Now this yard, things are getting a little worse, but it's still ultimately for non-violent crimes, not necessarily non-violent criminals. So serious crimes without violence is the definition that gets you in here. Sentences up to 5 years generally, but it's sort of a guideline. So it actually becomes known as the Noongar Division, as a lot of Aboriginal people are committing the sorts of non-violent and minor crimes that fill up this division. And like in all Australian prisons, this one is no different. Aboriginal people are disproportionately represented. They make up 3 to 4% of the population. Outside of prison, they make up more like 40% of the population inside prison. There's a lot of examples of gross mistreatment in Australian prisons. This one is, again, just the same. 1984, there was a terrible incident where a man called Robert Walker, an Aboriginal man, was taken out of his cell in the middle of the night suffering a psychotic episode, and in the guards' efforts to restrain him and sedate him, they essentially suffocated him to death. This way of restraining also involved a good 17 minutes of kicking him and beating him as well, which doesn't sound all that necessary. And if, you know, there's an inquiry, but it doesn't really get to the bottom of it. There's no charges, and the official cause of death is just misadventure, which doesn't really hit the nail on the head, you'd say. Now, the most notorious inmates of this division were here in the 1980s. They were called the Mickelberg brothers, Peter, Brian, and Ray. who was sentenced here for 12, 16 and 20 years for robbing almost $2 million worth of gold from the Perth Mint. They spent their time in here desperately trying to prove their innocence. They eventually did. To this day, no one actually knows who was responsible for the robbery. No one's seen the gold ever since. The detectives that took all of the glory of putting these guys away, one of them was actually shot by a bikie gang a few years afterwards, but the other guy actually confessed to forging the confessions and making up the evidence, and then he killed himself as well. So there's a whole lot of big conspiracy around it. People these days generally are torn between still suspecting the Mickelbergs and just as many suspect the police were in Terrace. It's one of the great mysteries. And in this yard for so-called non-violent crimes doesn't mean it's a non-violent yard. So famously, Ray Mickelberg down the far end got into a big vicious fight with other inmates, had his finger bitten off altogether, which I think around here somewhere. Oh, there he is there. Now, there's not a lot for prisoners to do in these yards, okay? And there's only about half the population is stuck out here every day. Everyone's out here on the weekends. You can see what we're standing on is both a basketball and a tennis court. They're desperate to give them something to do. They just don't have stuff for everyone to do. So there's a lot of people just standing around, pacing, running laps, playing cards, board games, chess, taking drugs, getting drunk on moonshine they brew up in their cells, and all sorts of things like that. A lot of people in a really bland area, bored out of their minds, frustrated, going through all sorts of internal hell. You know, they're getting on each other's nerves eventually. I mean, even if just us had to stand out here together all across the day, by the end of the day, you can, just looking around at some of you, there's no doubt we're going to get on each other's nerves, especially if I keep talking as much as I am. All right. We'll talk more about the artwork a little bit later on, but in short, it was done in the last 12 months of the prison, and the prisoners were the ones that did it. But I'll talk more about that a little bit later. This is the routine that the prisoners would live by for the last 100 years in here. It would change a little over the years, of course, but this is pretty much it. 6:45, you wake up to the sound of the bell that rang out the tour for us. You get up, get dressed, and pick up your bucket. Could you just hold on to that for me for a sec? I don't like to hold it because it's the toilet. But you would empty that out in the yard outside. Straight back in, line up on these lines, you get counted, you get your food off the trolleys that have come down, and you would eat your breakfast alone in your cell. Most prisoners, most of the time, have the cell for themselves. And then after an hour, they return to the yard. If you're working, you're sent to work. Otherwise, you're in the yard. 3 hours later, everyone returns to the yard. You get counted again, and you get fed. An hour later, you go back to work, or stay in the yard.
Can you stay in your house?
No, not during the week. And then 3 hours later, close to 4 o'clock, you return to the yard, you file back in here, line up, get counted, get your food off the trolleys and back into your cell. You're essentially in your cell from 4 p.m. each afternoon until 8 a.m. in the morning. 16 hours. It's horrible in there. All right, we'll see inside cells really soon. These solid corrugated iron doors obviously don't let too much airflow through them. There's about 700 inmates, in this entire cell block. And they've all got a bucket. They get 2 showers a week. They're smoking cigarettes around the clock. It gets stinking hot in Fremantle in the height of summer, which means it gets over 50 degrees in the top floor cells, they say. The stench in here is unimaginable.
How many people would you in one cell?
Mostly one, sometimes 2 when the population gets to that point. Now, if you're working, you're earning money. Okay? You can buy things by filling out a spend slip here. This goes to the canteen. The luxury man, as they call the prisoner that runs the canteen, will deliver your goods to your cell. 10% of the wage you earn is a forced saving, so you're not destitute when you're released. And C63 forms allow you to manage that account. Blue forms are for anything to do with life in the prison. About arranging phone calls, visits, lawyers, even like maybe a turned vegetarian, maybe your bed's broken, or all these sorts of things. Mail, ingoing and outgoing mail is all checked by guards first, and it can be rejected based on language or content. Everything moves through a filter. You have no choices of your own. They're approved by everybody else. Everything, any choice is a privilege, basically.
What if your mail doesn't fit inside?
What's that?
What if your mail doesn't fit inside?
If your mail doesn't fit, then it's probably not going to go anywhere. Now, they put this suicide net up in 1923, catching people throwing themselves at each other from above. No doubt there's plenty of people, it's not hard to imagine, that don't like life in their cell, don't like life in the yard. There's really no refuge, there's no escape, they can't wait. There are some people that go through absolute hell in a place like this, surrounded by the people that they're sharing the space with, and this is their best way out, it seems. Okay. Right now, we're going to head to the gallows. After that, we're going to have a look in the cells. But the gallows, just to give you all fair warning, it's a horrible place. The scaffold is in there, the noose is hanging there. So I'll tell you about the people that have been hanged and exactly how it happens. It's a pretty dark atmosphere inside, of course. If you don't want to come in, and you wouldn't be the first to not do that, you're welcome to just hang out, so to speak, in the next division for a few minutes instead. Now, everything's original in here, except for the fan, of course. The cages have just been put in to keep it all safe. The rope, our authentic replica, I believe, is getting fixed at the moment. Should be back soon. But this is pretty close to it. All the details are the same. The sort of clear covering over the rope that goes or fits around your neck, so you don't get chafing at the last minute. You don't want it to be as comfortable as possible. The buckle there is what they've always used here, different to what we're used to seeing in movies with that famous knot that the 13 wraps around itself. The hangman would arrive the day before. He'd check that everything's working. Then he'd meet with the prisoner, and according to his height and his weight, he would cut the rope to be the right length. There's a chart that tells him those measurements. And then he boils the rope, he attaches a sandbag and drops it, all to remove the elasticity. And then on the morning of the hanging, they collect the prisoner from his death row cell, which is over a new division. He spent generally a period of months, not years, in there. 5:30 that morning, he's given a new uniform with laces down the front to put on. 4 guards, known as cornermen, escort him through the prison into his holding cell behind here in solitary confinement. He'll spend the last 2 hours of his life, 6 to 8 a.m, it's generally Monday, in there. A guard is in there with him as well. He'll offer him tea and toast, a meeting with a priest or someone similar, a glass of brandy or two for his nerves. Just before 8 o'clock, he's shackled, he's handcuffed and he's hooded, and he's marched into here. He doesn't see anything in here. He's escorted underneath the rope. Okay, the trapdoors are obviously closed. If he can't stand up, he's given this chair to sit on. And the 4 cornermen, those guards that escorted him all the way, take their places on these corners, standing on these beams, a hand on the railing, a hand on his shoulder, keeping him steady, his shoulders square, ensuring that he falls perfectly straight and allows the noose to work as efficiently as possible. So the hangman places the noose around the man's neck, tightens the buckle up under the right-hand side of his jaw. As the clock strikes 8, he throws the lever, the trapdoor's open, and he drops the 6 feet to his fate. If all goes to plan, that buckle will throw his head back into the side and dislocate his vertebrae and sever the spinal cord, and death will be instant. Okay, it's not through strangulation. Strangulation is there as a backup. It's plan B. He's left hanging at the bottom for another 10 to 20 minutes. When the doctor walks down those stairs, they attach another rope to his waist. They lower it down. It's fed through that little hook to the side up there. The doctor will check the pulse, pronounce him dead. Within a few hours, a hearse will have taken him to Fremantle Cemetery to be buried in an unmarked grave. This all happens in front of 12 witnesses, or at least they aim for 12. That 12 consists of those guards, the hangman, his assistant, the doctor, the priest, a few officials. The 12 means that this guy's number 13. There's 13 spaces between the beams up here, and there's 13 steps to the bottom of the recovery room, which is of course 13 feet deep. 44 people have been hanged in here. If you look at the beam closely, you'll see notches cut into it from the ropes over the years. Only one woman was hanged here, Martha Rendell, 1909. The last woman hanged in Australia, the only woman hanged in this place. Hanged for murdering 3 of her stepchildren. They suffered from diphtheria. She got sicker than coughing, swabbed hydrochloric acid on their throats, and they choked to death in a very agonising way. Or so they said. Sounds like terrible when you describe her like that. As the years wear on, more and more people believe that she's actually innocent. She was trying to do the right thing, and she was condemned just for being a stepmother. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to the women's division. I'll provide a bit more context for you there. She's buried a couple of feet below Eric Edgar Cook in the same grave, same unmarked grave. It's marked these days though. He was known as the Night Caller. He was hanged in 1964 in October, the last man hanged in WA. He was called the Night Caller because he used to call in to people's houses randomly at night in the suburbs all around Perth. Initially a peeping Tom and petty thief, but escalating until he was eventually an outright serial killer, stabbing, shooting people in their sleep as they answered the door. Random violence. When they caught him, he confessed to everything that he'd done over the last several years. Over 200 burglaries, 14 attempted murders and 8 murders. All with a photographic memory. Incredible detail. And that was great news for 2 prisoners in here already for 2 of the murders that he just confesses to. Sadly, their appeals are thrown out of court because no one's prepared to believe the word of this serial killer. So these guys do 5 and 12 years, and it's not actually until 2002 that they're proven innocent with the release of a book called Broken Lives. It doesn't always go to plan, of course. The very first hanging didn't go to plan. It was of an Aboriginal man called Jimmy Long. It was over a decade, by the way, before they hanged anyone of European descent. He asked for a glass of water just moments before they threw the lever, and so they granted him that request, paused, lifted the hood up, loosened the rope, had a drink, they pulled the hood back over, threw the lever, forgetting to tighten the rope again. It slipped up, tore his ear off, he strangled to death instead. Some people's ropes are a bit too short, some say it's accidental, some say it's not. Sometimes he'll lean or sway, or just, things are just not quite right. And that fine detail can make all the difference. You can be left strangling for 10 minutes on occasion. One guy in the 1920s actually lost his head altogether. The rope was too long. To be fair, his neckline and jaw was all damaged. He tried to blow his own head off. And so, his head was actually torn off by the noose altogether. It bounced, it popped up and it hit the beam up there and bounced over this way. And there's people standing right there where you were, and they hit it back and it went on the other side, and someone hit it back over this side and went back and forth for quite some time. It was quite an impressive rally. If you want to take a photo, you're more than welcome. I'm afraid I can't let you guys have a go of it today. There's been a few incidents in the past. If you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll Now, this is 3rd Division. They call it Main Division. This is for reasonably long sentences now, 10 years up to, generally violent crimes. And they call it Main Division. The most violent person, too violent to be mixing with anyone else, will be thrown into this cell to keep everyone else safe. There's a yard out the back just for him. This is his whole prison. Inside, the furnace is bolted down. He's got thongs instead of shoes and plastic cutlery. The door opens outwards so he can't lock himself in. Excuse me. And so the guard doesn't step in to there blindly and, you know, in a vulnerable position. Now, this cell here, I'm just going to summarise a few things, by the way, and then I'll give you guys time to look around at everything. This cell is an observation cell for anyone at risk of suicide or self-harm. So big windows, nothing but a slab of cement and a mattress as your bed. The quilt on it, by the way, is held together with a really weak thread that would fall apart if he tried to hang himself with it. You take his belt and his shoelaces. You do what you can, but a lot of these prisoners, when they get to that point, are incredibly determined and very creative as well. Over this side is a timeline of cells. So the first two are from the convict era, just 7 by 4 foot of their dimensions. When it becomes the maximum security prison that we're talking about, a Royal Commission demands much bigger cells. So they knock down every second wall and double the size, because they now spend 16 hours in there, of course. I'll leave you guys to explore the changes from here, and I'll tell you about the artwork in a few minutes and a few other things. In here is sent to a very low security prison called Barton's Mill. 13 prisoners escape on the first night. So they bring the more dangerous ones back here and they continue to stay in the southern half of the cell block. The northern half is used by the military. The hospital during that time is an internment camp for enemy aliens, resident Germans, Japanese, people they suspected of spies during that time. In the 60s though, the population soars over capacity in this post-war period with baby boomers and a lot of behavioural crime. This is when it gets up to about 1900 inmates. So they introduce bunks just to accommodate everyone. And they have a flushing toilet also for about 2 weeks in each cell. Unfortunately, the prisoners start drinking the chemicals from the bottom of that toilet. One of the chemicals is alcohol, and they put it through a crude filtering system. They bore it through a sock, and then they drink it. Now, the artwork that you see pops up towards the end. It starts with this guy in A24. They call him Peg Leg because he had a wooden leg. He was a very violent prisoner. He was in and out of prison for 44 years, but it seems that he's actually rewarded for bad behaviour, in a sense. Painting calmed him down, and it made him easier to deal with. And so it just made life easier for everyone if he had a paintbrush in his cell. A few years later, when they know the prison is closing, in those last months, they allow a lot more prisoners that option of painting on their cell or in the walls in the yard and things like that. You get a lot of fantastic artwork in various forms. There's a lot of really nasty artwork as well, of course, in a place like this. This one in particular is incredibly impressive. It's by an Aboriginal man called Quartermain, who they call this style, this distinctive style, a Carolup style, as it comes out of this orphanage in Carolup down south. And kids from the stolen generation were sent there in the late 40s and early 50s, where amazingly they were encouraged to paint. This was very strange in that era. And these kids, aged 7 to 14, just came up with their own style, this very distinctive style. And it got incredibly popular, the exhibition that was sent out, and it toured the world. And it's an amazing story unto itself. Just down this way a bit, there's a giant photograph on the wall up there that shows you the main event that caused the prison to close shortly after. So have one last look at these paintings and then come down and I'll tell you about Terrace was killed or they went down the road from them and things like that. Now, this photograph up here shows you the beginning of the end. So 4th of January 1988. the height of summer, 44 degrees. Prisoners are scheduled to come in from the yard where they've been in all day, sweltering. They let in the first 6 prisoners at 4 o'clock that afternoon as per the routine. They set foot inside this gate and then they run through the guards straight away and distracting them for a moment long enough for the next 100 inmates to also charge through the gates and quickly overpower all of the guards in divisions 3 and 4. They beat them from all angles. They steal their keys, they rush upstairs, tear furniture out, pile it up, douse it with lawnmower fuel that they've smuggled in as well, and set the place alight. And it goes up in flames. You can see the blackened beams in the ceiling down there, and obviously the end result in the photograph behind us. What they call the fire brigade. We rush out, their big 1980s fire truck. Too big for the front gate, built in the 1850s for a horse and cart, so they can't actually fight the fire from inside the prison. Eventually, inmates take the guards as hostages and move out to the yard. They're confronted by a riot squad out there. They try and negotiate, but that goes nowhere. Until the next morning, when one guard is really sick, so they exchange him saving his life for a whole pile of baked beans. A few hours later, another guard is exchanged for a pile of cigarettes. A few hours after that, 18 hours in total, and the siege comes to an end. They hand over control back to the prison. In the aftermath, they spent nearly $2 million to repair the building from that. Over 33 inmates are charged. No one died, no shots were fired, which is amazing, but all the guards caught up in it would never be able to return to work, suffering endless trauma. And an inquiry condemns the whole place to close. And within 4 years, it has. Everyone's sent down to Casuarina prison, and a lot of them are still there, living happily ever after at the end. We're going to head on through this way, through 4th Division along. This is the Crown Theatre. There was so they were trying movies in here on the weekends. Bands might come and play, or theatre shows. Female inmates would come and watch as well from the balcony up there. Obviously this is a reward, a privilege. You can only get that if you've been doing the right thing. If you're not, then you would lose this amongst other privileges like phone calls or visits or access to the money in your accounts, things like that. Okay, we're going to move on into the new division. As we do, just take note of the cells to the right. Built 50 years after the other one, built out of a different stone, it's lasted a lot better. We hold death row inmates down there, and otherwise it's an overflow division. It fills different purposes at different times. After the riot, which was a protest, they locked up 12 prisoners they deemed to be the ringleaders. They called them Dirty Dozen. They locked them up in these 12 cells here. They put an extra bar across the door, and they put this cage around it to heighten security as well. These guys continued to protest, going on a hunger strike. The doctors watched their health, but they needn't worry because they weren't starving. One guy even put on some weight during these couple of weeks. And the guards got suspicious and they put grills across the bars of the windows outside. And as soon as they did that, they stopped their fasting. And they stopped, which stopped other prisoners buying things from the canteen and feeding them through the bars from the outside. Now, if you take this cage and bring it over here, I'll have about death row. We can fill it up pretty easily. Do you guys want to go inside? So death row. So people waiting to be hanged. Death row cells used to be this entire row along here. At some point, they sadly realised that it wasn't as popular as they once hoped it would be, and so they shrunk it to just that section there. But there was a fence about a metre out all the way along, and you got the doors like this mesh, so you could sort of see through them a little bit. Inside the cell, just a mattress on the floor, a blanket, a Bible and a bucket. 23 hours a day in there, 1 hour exercising alone in the laneway on the other side, and a guard sits outside of your cell the whole time, watching you like a hawk, ideally, taking notes every 2 minutes, making sure that you don't commit suicide, making sure that nothing happens to you that's going to delay the hangman, that's going to help you wriggle out of your fate, basically. In spite of that, 1947, someone did. He managed to take his own life under the nose of a guard sitting from you and me away before the hangman could do his job. The last 2 weeks of your death row sentence is actually spent in a big cell at the end, just where those guys are standing outside. See how the wall juts out? Well, that used to be just a fence as well, and it would surround 3 cells, which you converted into a day cell, a night cell with a bed, and a bathroom. So you're totally secluded and self-sufficient for that last 2 weeks. It's a strange atmosphere that descends upon the place on the mornings of a hanging. They bring in extra guards and things. Just the whole place is very, very volatile. And by the same token, that person in the last 2 weeks of his life, can become. It's a pretty intense time, of course. There's a lot of personal reflection, a lot of time spent with a priest or someone similar. But they just kind of limit his potential influence or impact on others around him. He's watched closer, those sorts of things. Okay. We're fast running out of time, and we're going to go around the corner to the women's division. So, should we run or?
Run.
Actually, no, we can't. If we run, we'll be shot. So this was the women's division from 1890 to 1970. It held up to about 70 women at a time, generally convicted of petty crimes. And these crimes, these so-called crimes, are listed on these pages that are on the walls here, straight out of the prison's register. The crimes from 100 years ago that locked women up in here are pretty strange by today's standards, incredibly petty. Evil fame is something you'll see often in there. That means having a bad reputation. Loitering, idleness, vagrancy, bad language, refusing to give a name, simply being drunk. This is what fills this prison up. Alright? This is your regular Friday night these days. Now, it paints a pretty bleak picture for women around Fremantle at the time. If you weren't married, weren't a maid or a servant, then there's not a lot of options for you. It was difficult to get on. Prostitution appears to be quite a common option, but obviously that's not many women's first option. Nor is coming to jail, which also seems to be a popular thing, because at least in here you've got a bed and you've got some meals, basically, and your options aren't looking great if you're choosing to come in here. There's a theory, there's an idea that there was a very narrow path that women were expected to walk in those days, and if they deviated too far from it, well, they could quite easily find themselves in jail or, you know, condemned in one form or another. And this is where we come back to Martha Randell. If you consider this context, you know, where women are being locked up for having a bad reputation. Of course, if you're a stepmother, you know, if you've abandoned your family and you've moved into someone else's, that's not going to give you a good reputation. And so that's where this sort of the story goes that she was hanged just for being a stepmother, essentially. Now, it was relatively self-sufficient, this division. There was a matron that ran it. She actually lived on site. Her house is attached to this building. They say that she even had a family in here on occasions as well. Female officers would run the show, and there'd be one or two watching over them of a night time. Only in those more vulnerable occasions would they ever really have the need to call on the male prison for help, but it was very rare. Otherwise, they just do their own thing. The work that they do, though, was, you know, traditional women's work. They're doing all of the laundry and all the cleaning for the men and themselves. If you were pregnant while you were in prison, you would give birth in Fremantle Hospital down the road, and then you'd have 3 months to care for your child in the confines of your cell. And following that, your child is handed on to your family, ideally. Failing that, an orphanage. Now, in 1970, the women's division was closed down, and all the women were sent to Bandy Women's Prison, which is still open out near the Swan Valley. And this place was transformed into a place of education and reform. TAFE classes, art classes, counselling sessions, things like that would happen in here. As great as that might have sounded, there's a lot of red tape, and it wasn't actually that easy to access. And so generally the people in most dire need never actually got to access this stuff. So the artwork comes care of the male prisoners that were employed to do this, to, you know, make these cells nicer for counselling sessions, for example. But have a little look around, and then in a moment we'll head out the back of the cell, just back there, into the cage where women would spend their 1 hour of exercise when they're on solitary confinement, which is what these cells here used to be used for. Is anybody